1 Kings chapter 8, verses 1 through 13. This is the story of Solomon finishing the construction of the temple and the very day that God's Spirit comes into the new temple that's been built. And this is just an incredible picture in the greater story of God and his presence among his people. This is one of those high points in that major story all the way from Genesis to Revelation. And we're just going to walk through it in the same way that we would through any other kind of story or narrative using a plot line. So it begins, then King Solomon summoned into his presence at Jerusalem the elders of Israel. The elders of Israel, the heads of the tribes, and the chief priests, and the chiefs of the Israelite families. So we see here in this first group that there's a summoning, right? And we see this a lot in the Old Testament. They call them assemblies, and today we even might call it a solemn assembly. But there's an assembly of the elders, the heads of the tribes, and the chiefs of the families. So all of the leadership, the representative leadership of the nation is here. And they have been gathered to bring, it's pretty fat there, 1 second. All right. To bring up the Ark of the Lord's covenant. Remember that the covenant that God made was at Sinai with the people of Israel. And the Ark there is the symbol of the covenant. It's the place where the people, where God's presence was supposed to be. And it's coming up from Zion, the city of David. So let's float back to our plot line and just talk about verse 1. Israel is summoned by Solomon. That's how it begins. It's a big deal to summon the entire nation, right? And here again, representatively through these people. And they've gathered to bring up the Ark of the Lord's covenant from Zion, the city of David. So we know that the temple is in the city of David. It's in Zion. If you could think about it, like imagine that Jerusalem is like this. When Solomon built the temple, he expanded it to the north, and this would be the kind of the temple mound. And so the ark is simply moving from right here in the city up to the temple mount. That's the whole movement. It's not very far at all. And yet, this is such a big deal that everyone must be gathered to this. All right, so the next thing is that all the Israelites came together to King Solomon at the time of the festival in the month of Ethanim, the 7th month. So let's go back to our plot line real quick. And then just verse 2, Israel summoned by Solomon. And here let's just note that this is the leaders. And then in verse 2, literally now all the nation. The Israelites have been gathered. And throughout both of these, the ark moves to the temple. All right, let's go back. The next thing for us to note here, and this is just kind of to explain, is that this happens in the 7th month. If you go back a couple chapters, I think it's in chapter 5 or chapter 6, you'll note that the temple was finished in the 8th month. So they're moving into the temple in the 7th month, but it was finished in the 8th month. How is this possible? Well, it's basically that, basically what's gone between those two chapters is 11 months have finished. So it's 11 months after the completion of the temple. It was completed in the 8th month of the previous year. For the last 11 months, we've just been preparing. So preparing animals for sacrifice, doing the finishing touches of the kind of ornate decorations that would be in the temple, and then waiting particularly for this 7th month. There's a festival in this month that's of key importance that they want to use as the kind of gathering time for this for the temple dedication. And the festival in the 7th month is the festival of booths. It was a festival where the Israelites would make tents. They would make temporary dwellings. They would live in them for a week, and they would remember God's presence with them in the tabernacle in the wilderness for 40 years. They would remember that time of wilderness wandering by living in booths. It was the Festival of Booths. It was also like a harvest festival. It came at the end of the harvest, and many people went back to Jerusalem for that. So King Solomon has decided to align the Festival of Booths with the dedication of the temple, which makes a lot of sense. And we're going to see in these next verses how that shows up in an interesting way. So the next piece, when all the elders of Israel had arrived, the priests took up the ark. So the movement begins. And so let's go back to our plot line, right? And that'll be, so the ark moves to the temple. That's verse 3. Now coming back to here, and they brought up the ark of the Lord and the tent of meeting and all the sacred furnishings in it. The tent of meeting, this is called the tabernacle. It had functioned as the temple, if you will, in Israel for many years. It resided in another city called, I think, Beth Odem, if I'm remembering properly. Please forgive me if I'm remembering that in error. And so it was the tent of meeting. The whole tabernacle gets broken down and brought to the city of Jerusalem, and all of the sacred furnishings in it, everything that was inside, all of things are brought. So during the Festival of Booths, where the Israelites would live in a tent, the tent in which God has been residing, his presence has been residing ever since the Exodus is brought up for this event. So again, the 7th month, the booth, the tabernacle, there's this theme here of God being with his people in that temporary way. They're thinking about that, and all of their history is in effect witnessing to the present moment. And so let's just come back here to this chart. Like the first kind of major theological observation that we might make is that history is witnessing the dedication and being fulfilled as well. There is, you will notice that when God makes these major movements in history, if you could see the timeline from Genesis to Revelation, that if there's a major movement in the kind of the plot line of history, that these moments, they're often tied together. They look back on the previous moments. And that is certainly what we're seeing here with the dedication of the temple. The priests and the Levites carried them up. So remember that the Levites were an entire tribe. The priests were a particular family within the tribe of the Levites, and they carried up the tabernacle. That's all according to the Old Testament laws regarding the Levites and those sorts of things. So verse 3 through 4, all of that is happening. And then coming back to verse 5, and King Solomon and the entire assembly of Israel that had gathered about him were before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and cattle that they could not be recorded or counted. So what we have here now in verse 5 is an abundance of sacrifices. And that tells us a couple things. First, that all Israel, not just the Levites, not just the priests, not just Solomon, but all Israel is sacrificing, right? And that's a good thing. That people have come prepared to worship. They see the need to make sacrifices on this day. But here's the other reality, is that for God to be with man, death is necessary. And you'll see this whenever we have those moments of God with man. You're going to see that death is necessary. You follow that theme throughout Scripture. You think of Genesis 3 in the garden, and Adam and Eve clothed themselves, and God clothes them with the skin of an animal. There's death there. You think of the the tabernacle and the temple, and there is a ton of death in the sacrifices there. So that's Exodus and First Kings. You think of Jesus and him tearing the veil in the temple, but what's required is Jesus's death. But then, finally, in Revelation, as we get to be with God forever, he finally says that death is no more. But that's because sin is done away with as well. But as long as sin is present, death is a common theme throughout being with God. There is a high price to be paid when sinners are moving to be with their God. And of course, the book of Hebrews reminds us that the blood of bulls and goats could never truly atone for our sin. And of course, that's why God has to send his own son to do the dying. So this is verse 5. There's such a multitude of sacrifices they cannot be recorded or counted. Verse 6. The priests then brought the ark of the Lord's covenant to its place in the inner sanctuary of the temple, the most holy place. So if you remember, there's this temple, and this is the outer courts, and then within that is the temple structure itself called the holy place, and then within that was this back room called the holiest place, the most holy place, the Holy of Holies. And that is where the ark of the covenant resided in there. And it was the same way within the tabernacle. And remember that between those two things is a big curtain. And so what he's saying here in the next one is, and put beneath the wings of the cherubim. So there was this piece of construction in there where they had these cherubim that they had made. We don't know what they look like, but they had wings that were over this area. And so the Ark of the Covenant is placed beneath the wings of the cherubim. The cherubim spread their wings over the place of the ark and overshadowed the ark and its carrying poles. So, if we're coming back here, verses 6 through 7, if I'm getting that right, let me go back real quick. Yeah, verses 6 through 7. The ark is placed in the holiest place. This place, this room, the most holy place, was only entered once per year for the Day of Atonement. And then right now for the placing of the ark in that room. The poles were so long that their ends could be seen from the holy place in front of the inner sanctuary, but not from outside the holy place, and they are still there today. So it's saying it's like if you were out here, you weren't going to be able to see the poles, but if you were in here, then you could see the poles sticking out from the most holy place. And so what we see then in verse 8 is that as the poles stick out, what we're seeing is God is with us, but there is still separation. Still separation. All right. 9. There was nothing in the ark except the 2 stone tablets that Moses had placed in it at Horeb, where the Lord had made a covenant with the Israelites after they came out of Egypt. You might remember Aaron's staff and the jar of manna. Those things were not kept in the Ark of the Covenant, but they were next to it. So these 2 pieces have disappeared. They're gone now. We don't know where they are, but the Ark of the Covenant, right, and these 2 stone tablets are the 10 Commandments. That is the covenant, right? That is the covenant. So the Ark of the Covenant still remains in covenant. You might remember that the Philistines had at one point taken the Ark of the Covenant away from the Israelites, and nevertheless, and it looks like they were about to return the Ark of the Covenant empty, and they were told, don't return it empty. So it looks like the 2 stone tablets have been put back inside the Ark of the Covenant, and it's placed there. So that last part, which was verse 9, what we're reminded by this detail of the tablet pieces, verse 9, is that the covenant remains, right? For God to bless his people and to be with his people always, as long as they obey him, that is there, even to this day, right? Or to this moment in our story, that we're looking at right now. Now, verse 10, when the priests withdrew from the holy place, so they placed the ark down and then they withdraw. They are not present for this. Then, right, when this happened, then the cloud filled the temple of the Lord, and the priests could not perform their services because of the cloud. This cloud is as we see down here in verse 12, a dark cloud. You can't see within the cloud. So God's presence descends into the temple, and yet it is hidden within this dark cloud. For the glory of the Lord filled his temple. So despite all of the sacrifices that have taken place, when God fills the temple, the people, even the priests, even despite their sacrifices, are still not allowed to be in his presence, right? And this, I believe, is the high point of the story, verses 10 through 11. The first thing that is so important about this is that God is with his people. In a very real, very tangible way, anyone can look at the temple, look at the dark cloud, and say, God is with us. And yet, at the same time, there is separation. Because of sin, God's presence is hidden. Though it's in that dark cloud, we can't see the fullness of his glory. And even the priests can't be in that place while his presence is so powerful, while that dark cloud remains. They're unable to perform their duties, and they have to kind of watch from outside. And so God is with his people, but there's this separation. They can't touch each other, right? And this is why when we think about particularly Jesus, this theme throughout Scripture is so very important, because when Jesus comes into the manger, he's being held, right, by his mom and by his dad and looked at by the shepherds, and we could touch him. God was with his people in a whole new way with Jesus, in a way that the Old Testament people could never have conceived of or imagined. And then verse 12. This is Solomon's kind of word on the whole thing, and it's the closing of this major moment in church history. Then Solomon said, "The Lord has said that he would dwell in dark clouds." So that's not a big surprise. All right. But the next part is interesting. He says, "I have indeed built a magnificent temple for you, a place for you to dwell forever." And that's so interesting, right? Because it is a magnificent temple. It's true. But it's not the place where God will dwell forever. I mean, that was the hope, right? But ultimately we know that God's temple is the church itself, that he has built his own temple through the living stones of his body, and that is the church, and that's where we are, and that's where he dwells forever. So let's go back to this, and in the falling action of verses 12 through verse 13, we see Solomon's commentary and his hope, but also his inaccuracies, right? God is going to dwell with his people forever, but this temple isn't going to be able to hold them. And if you keep reading in this chapter, I encourage you to do so. Solomon will recognize that. In his very prayer, he'll say, thank you for being in this temple, but I mean, what temple can hold your presence, God? You own the heavens and the earth and everything that's in them. And so just a beautiful picture there of a recognition of God's greatness, that he is greater than this magnificent temple that has been built. And so in this story, we see a lot about God and his efforts to be with his people. We see a lot about the obstacles and the necessity of death in order for us to be with God. And we see the incomplete presence of God with his people at the temple, that he's with them in a new and profound way, but it's still not quite what Adam and Eve had in the garden. And it's certainly not what we have with Jesus now or will have with him forever in eternity.